I discovered a hidden room behind my closet that rewrote my entire life and forced me to choose who I was willing to destroy. The night I discovered the hidden room behind my closet, I was hunting for an extra blanket because the heat had gone out again and my brother Eli hates the way his fingers feel when they get cold. He has this thing where he counts the tips of his fingers when he is anxious. 1 2 3 4, 1 2 3 4, until he calms down. I was halfway inside the closet, shoving aside a stack of board games we never play anymore, when the back panel shifted and a thin line of dust fell onto my face. Behind it, there was darkness, and somewhere inside that darkness, the half-forgotten smell of my childhood, mothballs and the sweetness of old paper. I wedged the panel out with careful fingers, making sure Eli in his room down the hall wouldn't hear the scrape and worry. Then I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight. The beam fell on a narrow room I had never known existed, the length of a coffin and twice as wide, paneling raw and splintered, walls scabbed with old wallpaper. There was a folding chair, a metal lockbox, and a stack of binder clips holding together dozens of letters tied with a shoelace. I felt the kind of chill that lives in your spine. This house belonged to my mother long before it belonged to me, and the closets, the corners, had the same stubborn familiarity of a face you have seen every day but never really looked at. I don't know why my first thought was that I should close it and pretend I'd seen nothing. Maybe because this house is glued together by secrets, and in it we have learned that opening one door usually slams another shut. But the lockbox had weight and gravity and a faint rattle inside that sounded like keys. I brought it out and set it on my bedroom floor, and while Eli hummed in the living room with his headphones on and an old cartoon he likes looping quietly, I slid a screwdriver into the lock and pried. The metal screamed, the hinge gave, and inside I found an old Polaroid, a brass pocket watch, a manila envelope with my father's insurance policy number written in my mother's handwriting, a battered VHS tape labeled Thanksgiving 2002, T, and a ring of keys on a SpongeBob keychain that wasn't ours. The Polaroid made my stomach tilt. My father, who died 17 years ago in a car accident on a rainy night that we never talked about because grief was like a room we all passed and shut, stood laughing with a man I recognized from exactly one place, the house next door. He is our neighbor, known for yelling about my trash cans being an inch over the property line, known for muttering under his breath about noise when Eli gets overwhelmed. In the photo, they were younger by decades, same height, shoulders bumped, holding a sign that read Schaefer and Ellison, we fix anything. My father, David Ellison, had died before the shop ever became anything more than an idea. Or so we were told. I held the photo at every angle, looking for a trick of light, the way you do when your brain says that cannot be right and your eyes don't care for your opinion. I put on a sweater and went next door. It was late, a little past 9, but lights were on in his kitchen. I had never actually stepped inside his house before. He answered on the third knock, his face folding into exasperation immediately. He didn't like me, but he tolerated me in the way you tolerate a loud neighbor when you can't move. He said, "It's late," and I said, "I need to show you something." When I held up the Polaroid, his eyes didn't widen, he didn't gasp. He blinked once. Slow. He took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and said, like he was asking about the weather, "Where did you get that?" I told him about the hidden room, about the lockbox, as little as I had, and he moved aside to let me in. His house smelled like pipe tobacco and lemon cleaner. He put a kettle on the stove in a motion so practiced it was muscle memory, and I stood by his table and felt a coil wind tight in my chest. He picked up the photo again, tapped the edge of it against the table, and then he said, "Your mother should have burned that." I wanted to be ready, to be angry, to ask him if this was a joke, but it wasn't. He told me his name was Tom, not Thomas like the mailbox said, and that he had known my father since they were 15 and they had built lawnmower engines for fun in a garage that smelled like gasoline and victory. He told me that the night my father died, he didn't die at all. He walked out of a hospital wearing a borrowed jacket and drove south until his voice changed in his throat. He said my father paid him to lie to the police. He said it like he was reading a grocery list, like it was a thing so practiced that he had long ago worn away the shame. I laughed. I couldn't stop. I laughed and it sounded like a cough turning inside out. That's not funny. He looked at me for a long time. His face is the kind that looks harsh even when it's not trying, all angles and a mouth like a line. He said, "He was my best friend. You can hate me for loving him." That made me feel sick. My father had paid a man to lie about his death? Who even does that? What is that level of selfish? I left without the answers I wanted or the ones I feared. The next morning, I took the VHS tape to my friend Kayla's apartment because she still has an old combo TV. We sat cross-legged on her floor with coffee that tasted like burnt sugar and pressed play. The tape buzzed with that static that sounds like rain in a tin bucket. And then there we were. Thanksgiving 2002. The dining room in our old house. The wallpaper with the ivy pattern. My mother, younger, her hair longer, the way she always tucked it behind her ear when she thought no one was watching. My father held the camera and tried too hard to be funny. He panned to Eli, age 5, lining up his peas on the edge of his plate. He panned to me, 9, making faces like kids do when they are halfway between wanting attention and hating it. The conversation was normal for 20 minutes. The turkey, the pie, the neighbors, the gravy too salty, my mother saying, it's fine," in that voice that was already practiced. Then Tom appeared in the frame and I paused. He was thinner and smiling, carrying a tray of rolls. He sat between my parents, and there was a moment, a kind of ripple, when he looked at my father and my father looked back, and if you knew where to look, if you recognized the tilt of a head, the way a hand lingers a beat longer than it should, you would see it. Kayla turned to me. "That's your neighbor." I nodded and felt like my tongue was glued to the roof of my mouth. At the end of the video, after we cut the pie and after my father told a story about a customer who tried to pay in stamps, there was a sudden shift in the camera angle like someone had forgotten to shut it off. It caught my father and Tom in the kitchen alone. My mother was in the dining room laughing with a cousin you could hear but not see. The audio was low, but you could make out the shape of the conversation. My father whispered, "It has to be this way," and Tom said, "Does she know?" And my father shook his head. Tom put his hand on the counter, then on my father's shoulder, and then the screen went black because someone finally hit stop. When the tape flickered to the blue screen, I looked at Kayla and she said, very softly, okay. That was all there was to say. For a day, I walked around with an extra heartbeat. I counted my steps like Eli counts his fingers. I watched my mother make tea and fold laundry and laugh at a video of a dog bumping into a window, and I felt like we were all standing in a room with the gas on, waiting for a spark. On Saturday, I drove to the records office downtown, this beige building with a metal detector and a ficus that requires exactly 11 minutes of sunlight per day. I asked for copies of my father's death certificate and any related documents, and the clerk with a hair bun high enough to touch God rifled through and said, weird, in a voice that people use when they are about to ruin your life and don't know it. She handed me a form with a red stamp that said copy and a note appended that read certificate amended 2009. I stared at it. Amended because of what? There was a notation in tiny print, discrepancy in identification markers, supplemental dental records requested. My father died in 2007. Why were there changes 2 years later? I went home, and the house felt too loud. Eli was humming and tapping the wall rhythmically, 4 beats and a pause. I made him a grilled cheese and cut it diagonally because triangles are always better, and then I told my mother we needed to talk. Her eyes, blue like they always were, flashed a warning that said not in front of him. I nodded. We waited until he was asleep, weighted blanket tucked under his arms, his mouth open slightly, his breath the quiet rise of tide. We sat at the kitchen table with the nick from where I had dropped a knife as a kid like a scar between us. I set the Polaroid and the taped copy of the certificate and the pocket watch on the table. The watch ticked. She didn't look away. She looked like a woman bracing for an ocean crossing in a canoe. He's alive, I said. Or he was alive after he wasn't. You knew. She pressed the heel of her hand into her left eye until her voice didn't shake. I knew he would try, she said. To run. To be saved, he always needed saving. By Tom. It wasn't a question. She flinched like the knife nick again, the memory of metal and surprise. The story came out the way coffee does when the filter breaks, flooding everything. My father had debts, not small ones, from a business that never became more than 2 men with a toolbox and a hope, and also from a complicated love he didn't know how to name in a town that made every difference a weapon.